in 1421. China had fleets so massive that Columbus ships could fit inside one of their vessels like a toy boat in a bathtub. They sailed to Africa, Southeast Asia, the Persian Gulf. They had the technology, the manpower, the resources. And yet, they never colonized anything. No plantations, no governors ruling overseas, no flags planted in foreign soil. Meanwhile, tiny Portugal, a country you could fit inside one Chinese province, was building a global empire. Spain, Britain, France, all racing to grab land. So what was China doing? Was it weakness? Or something completely different? This is the answer, and it'll change how you see both historical and modern China. Before we go further, we need to define what we're actually talking about. Empire gets thrown around constantly, but what does it really mean? Encyclopedia Britannica defines an empire as a political unit, where a central authority rules over territories and peoples beyond its original borders. Historically, empires like Rome, Britain, and Spain followed a specific pattern. Go overseas, grab territory. Set up colonies, extract resources, force, labor. Shipped wealth back home. They didn't just rule other people, they used other people. Rome stripped provinces of grain. Spain melted Aztec gold into bars. Britain turned India into a raw materials factory. That's the colonial empire model. And China, despite having every tool to run that exact playbook, never did. Not once. Let's start with the most jaw-dropping example, Zheng. Between 1405 and 1433, this Chinese admiral led 7 massive voyages across the Indian Ocean. His flagship was reportedly around 400 feet long. Columbus's Santa Maria, maybe 85 feet. Not even in the same category. Zheng's fleet visited Vietnam, Indonesia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. They traded, demonstrated Chinese power. Foreign rulers sent gifts back to China, including a giraffe, and then China stopped. The Mongol emperor died. New leadership decided the voyages were too expensive. It became illegal to build large ocean-going ships. Records were reportedly destroyed to erase the entire episode. His was wild. At no point during those 7 voyages did China try to colonize anywhere. They didn't set up a governor in didn't build a fort in East Africa and declare it Chinese territory. So what made an impression. Left to compare that to what the Portuguese were doing. By the early 1500s, Portugal had fortified trading posts across Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Small country. Massive territorial footprint. Totally different logic. So why didn't China do what Portugal did? First reason, geography. And this one is huge. China is enormous. At its height, the empire stretched from tropical south to freezing north, from the Pacific coast deep into Central Asia. Within those borders, you had virtually every climate, every crop, every resource a pre-industrial civilization could want. Rice from the Yangtze Delta, wheat from the north, silk, tea, salt, iron, coal, timber. Risked dangerous ocean voyages to extract resources from faraway places when you already had everything you needed at home. European powers, especially smaller ones like Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, they went overseas because they had to. The Americas gave Spain silver, the Caribbean gave Britain sugar. China didn't have that desperate need pushing it outward. The pressure to find stuff elsewhere just wasn't there. Second reason, internal philosophy. This one goes deep into how Chinese civilization thought about itself. The Chinese bureaucratic tradition, built on Confucian ideas, prioritized internal order, agricultural productivity, a well-fed population, stable government. That was the emperor's job. That was the measure of good. RULE/RSHIP. External conquest wasn't on that list. In fact, it was seen as risky. Every time China expanded aggressively outward, it created internal problems. Armies cost money. Long campaigns drain resources. Generals who win wars get powerful, maybe too powerful. And Chinese history had a deep, traumatic memory of what happened when things fell apart internally. Third reason, the fear of collapse. And I think this is the most emotionally powerful one. China went through periods of collapse that left scars on the national psyche for centuries. The Warring States period, roughly 475 to 221 BC, was 250 years of brutal, exhausting warfare. Millions dead. Entire regions devastated out. Then, the Three Kingdoms era. After the Han Dynasty collapsed, China fractured into three competing states. The warlord era in the early 20th century. After the Qing Dynasty fell, China broke apart again. Every single time China fragmented, it was catastrophic. The lesson burned into the culture. Unity is survival, division is death. So when you're a Chinese emperor thinking about launching a massive overseas colonial project, you're also thinking, what does this do to my ability to hold things together here? The risk wasn't worth it. Keeping China unified was the mission. Everything else was secondary. But here's where it gets interesting. China wasn't passive. China wasn't hiding behind walls, ignoring the world. It had its own system for managing relationships with other countries. It just looked completely different from the European colonial model. It was called the tribute system. Here's how it worked. Neighboring states Korea, Vietnam, parts of Central Asia, various Southeast Asian kingdoms would periodically send envoys to the Chinese emperor. The envoys would bring gifts. They'd perform rituals, acknowledging that the Chinese emperor was, in some symbolic sense, the center of the civilized world. In return, the emperor would give them gifts back, often worth more than what they brought. China would offer trade access, protection, diplomatic recognition. The neighboring country kept its own government, its own laws, its own culture. China didn't send administrators to run their affairs. There was no forced extraction of resources. It was a system built on symbolic hierarchy and economic incentive, not military occupation. Now, was this always voluntary? Not exactly. There is definitely a play-along or face consequences element, but the structure was fundamentally different from building plantations, forcing labor, and shipping raw materials home across an ocean. Korea kept its language, monarchy, culture. Vietnam resisted Chinese control fiercely and eventually maintained independence. Compare that to what happened to indigenous populations in the Americas under Spanish rule, or the people of Bengal under the East India Company. The comparison isn't even close. Now, to be fair, this picture isn't perfectly clean. There are moments in Chinese history that look a lot more like classic empire building. The Qing Dynasty, which ruled from 1644 to 1912, cascaded massively. Xinjiang deep in Central Asia, incorporated Mongolia. At its largest, the Qing Empire was one of the biggest empires in world history by land area. But notice what these expansions have in common. They're all continental, all in the same neighborhood. And the logic was defensive as much as offensive. Controlling the steppe frontier meant keeping nomadic raiders out. Controlling Tibet meant controlling the high ground. These were buffer zones, not extraction colonies. It's very different from sailing to West Africa, building a slave fort, and shipping human beings across an ocean to work sugar plantations in the Caribbean. The mechanics of power look different. The economic logic looks different. The human cost, while real in China's expansion too, operated through different systems. Okay, here's where things get genuinely complicated. Because right now, in 2025, you'll hear people say, China is building an empire. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive infrastructure investment program, has poured money into roads, ports, railways across Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South America. Critics say China is using debt as a weapon, building infrastructure in poor countries, getting them financially dependent, then using that leverage for political influence. They call it debt trap diplomacy. Supporters say China is doing what wealthy countries always do, investing abroad, to gain influence, except without the military occupation part. Here's what's actually measurable. As of now, China has one overseas military base, Djibouti, a tiny country on the Horn of Africa. The United States has somewhere between 700 and 800 military bases in foreign countries, depending on how you count. Britain, France, and the US still have overseas territories, actual territories, where they have formal political control. China, as of today, has none of that. Now, does that mean China's global influence is harmless or benign? That's a separate question, and a legitimate one. Researchers who study this, people like Deborah Brotigam at Johns Hopkins, who spent decades looking at Chinese investment in Africa, say the debt trap narrative is often exaggerated. Many of those loans were renegotiated. Ports weren't seized. Feared military installations didn't materialize in most places. But the influence is real. The economic relationships are real. The political pressure that comes with those relationships is real. So what is China building? The honest answer: something new. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the old empire category. Not a colonial empire in the classical sense, but not nothing either. Maybe the right word is a network, a web of economic relationships, diplomatic ties, institutional influence that gives China leverage without requiring military occupation. Is that an empire, or is it just how powerful countries operate in the 21st century? Because the US does it to you, does Italiano, everyone does it. That's the more interesting question. The most important takeaway we spend a lot of time asking: is China an empire? But maybe the better question is, what does power actually look like when it doesn't take the form we expect? The European colonial model is so dominant in our historical imagination that we sometimes assume it's the only way a large, powerful civilization can express power internationally. But China's history is 4,000 years of evidence that there are other models, other logics, other ways of being powerful in the world. That doesn't make those models peaceful or harmless, but it does mean we need a more sophisticated vocabulary to talk about them. When Rome wanted influence, it built roads and put legions at the end of them. When Britain wanted influence, it built a navy and planted flags. When China historically wanted influence, it built trade relationships and invited foreign kings to perform rituals in Beijing. Today, China builds ports and offers loans. Same goal: influence, security, access to resources, completely different methods. If you want to understand what China is doing in the world right now, you're not going to get there by only looking at what Britain or Spain did in the 1600s. You have to look at what China did in the 1400s, and the 1600s, and the 1800s. The pattern is there. You just have to know what you're looking at. China never built a global colonial empire because it didn't need to, didn't want to, and had very specific historical reasons to avoid the risks that came with it. If this changed how you see empire and power throughout history, hit that like button and subscribe to Axis Lens for stories that reveal how civilizations actually operate. Next one's ready. Don't miss it. Don't miss it.